Good afternoon, everyone. This is Suzanne Weichel with CLASP, and we're just going to wait another minute or so for a few more people to log in, and then we'll get started. Okay, I think in the interest of time, because we have a very full agenda, we will go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Streamlining Medicaid Renewals webinar. We're very excited to have you with us today. This webinar is part of what we call the ASAP project, which is a joint project between CLASP and the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. We work with state-based advocates to identify ways to increase enrollment in work support programs, with a particular focus on Medicaid and SNAP. And we really approach this work around administrative barriers to enrollment and retention, and then also opportunities to align both Medicaid and SNAP. And today we'll be focusing specifically on a retention issue. Here on this slide, you'll just see the states that are shaded in orange are the states where we're currently working with advocates. We're in 9 states right now. And that has grown over the years of the project, and we love working with our state-based advocates. If you'd like to find out more information about the project, we do have sites on both the CLASP and the CBPP website where you can find several pieces of a toolkit that we have developed, and that toolkit we will be adding to over the coming year. So we encourage you to not only visit now and see what's there, but to bookmark it and go back to it every few months to see what's new. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Jennifer Wagner at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities to talk about the meat of the issue today.
Great. Thanks so much, Suzanne, and thanks everyone for joining us. Today, we're really going to dive into Medicaid renewals. So first, we'll touch on the importance of Medicaid renewals and why you as advocates should look into them in light of so many challenges that you have with these programs. Then we're going to take a deep dive into ex parte renewals and the opportunity that that presents to streamline and maintain enrollment. We'll touch on non-MAGI renewals and the opportunities for that population, and then discuss how to really dig in and see how your state is performing these renewals and where the opportunities are. My colleague Shelby will discuss fast-track strategies that help leverage enrollment in SNAP to further Medicaid renewals. And finally, we'll hear from colleagues at the Community Legal Services of Philadelphia and their experience in trying to dig into this issue in their state. So let's get started. So why are we focusing on Medicaid renewals? Well, they are required every 12 months for the MAGI population. And so it's something that people will encounter after they enroll in a program. And when a renewal has an inefficient process, it really increases the likelihood of procedural denials. And procedural denials are when a beneficiary fails to take some step in the process. They don't send in a form that's required, or they don't send in verification documents that are required, or the state agency fails to process that information that has been sent in. So the beneficiary loses coverage, not because they've been determined financially ineligible, but because they failed in some step along the process. And what that can do is lead to significant churn. And that's when eligible people lose benefits, but then come back on 1, 2, 3 months later because they're still eligible and they need care. So when clients churn on and off the program, this disrupts continuity of care for the client because they may not be able to get their prescription filled, may have to skip doctor appointments or other needed procedures. It's a burdensome re-enrollment process for clients as well. They have to contact the agency, figure out why they don't have coverage, figure out what steps they have to take to re-enroll. And it does create extra work for agencies. Completing an efficient renewal for a client that's already enrolled is much easier than having to do a reapplication process or field those different phone calls and inquiries. So efficient processes around Medicaid renewals benefit the beneficiary, the state or the county agency, as well as managed care organizations who really have an interest in maintaining that continuity of care and that connection with the clients that they serve, and also who might lose those clients if they fall off the program and re-enroll and have an opportunity to pick another MCO. And the reason to point that out is that there are a lot of people who have a lot of different entities that have an interest and an incentive for a more efficient Medicaid renewal process. Hopefully, a lot of the things that we're talking about during this session should not be controversial. And there's going to be potential for conversation in your state regardless of the political climate. This is not about expanding access or some other things that get dicey right now, but really about efficiency and maintaining coverage for eligible individuals. So what are these ex parte renewals? Well, the Affordable Care Act mandates that states try an ex parte renewal. And ex parte means essentially by one side. So it's the state trying to determine if clients remain eligible before they request information from the beneficiary. And this involves looking at data sources and seeing if those data sources indicate ongoing eligibility or not. When the state checks these data sources, if they do indicate ongoing eligibility, then the beneficiary is sent a notice that shows the basis of determination. It shows, we believe your household size is this, your income is this, and you're eligible for this benefit. The beneficiary is instructed to respond with updates if needed. But if they don't take any action, the beneficiary is renewed. The client has to respond if something's incorrect, but if they don't, the beneficiary is renewed. And that takes away a lot of the churn and the procedural denials in this process where a beneficiary might not get their notice, might not understand it, the agency may not process it when it's returned. They're taken care of. On the other hand, if the data source does not confirm ongoing eligibility, so perhaps there's insufficient information or the data source actually indicates that the client's no longer eligible, then the beneficiary needs to be sent a pre-populated renewal form, and they must respond to that form to continue coverage. So that process is a little bit more like pre-ACA days when states tended to just send a form and require that client sent it back in order to do a renewal. There are a few small changes there, but it's more of the traditional process. So for those of you who are a little bit more visual, here's kind of a diagram of what happens. First, the agency looks at data that's available to them about the household. If that data is able to be used to confirm ongoing eligibility, the beneficiary is notified, but they do not have to sign or return the notice as long as they're accurate. If the agency is unable to confirm ongoing eligibility based on those data sources, the beneficiary is sent a pre-populated form, and they must have at least 30 days to respond to that form. Further, if they don't respond, or if the document is not processed by the agency and they lose coverage at the end of their certification period, there is a 90-day reconsideration period. And that's where if the beneficiary loses coverage but comes back on and says, hey, I'm still eligible, I need coverage, the agency must accept a renewal document during that 90-day period and not make the beneficiary go through the whole application process all over again. So you can see really the benefits of going that top route of an ex parte renewal where the beneficiary gets a notice but doesn't have to do anything, the agency doesn't have to touch the case, and more eligible people are retained in the program. So how are states doing in these automated renewals or ex parte renewals? Well, the Kaiser 50-state survey has some questions related to renewals, and that's shown here on this slide. They ask how many states are actually processing automated renewals. Like many things, it's required in the federal regulations, but some states have not gotten to it quite yet. And we've seen this number increase over the years, but there are a handful of states who have not even started doing automated renewals. Then we see the percentage of renewals that are automated. Some states are doing less than 25%, some are doing over 75%. We'll see if the state is reporting that they send a pre-populated renewal form, and if they actually update that pre-populated form with data that they find recently in available data sources. Now, want to definitely urge caution in using this information. This is state-reported data. It is not independently verified by Kaiser. And states have varying definitions of automated and varying definitions of kind of ex parte and what pre-populated really means. So definitely take this information with a grain of salt. And if you see some stuff in your state that might not make total sense, definitely worth inquiring and seeing the details within the state. But what this information does provide is a vision of what's happening across the country and shows that there are a lot of states that are doing a very, very high percentage of their cases through the ex parte process. And this can be valuable if you engage in conversations with your agency and they say, oh, we can't get it higher than 20%. Oh, no other state with our eligibility system or with our combination of SNAP and Medicaid or lack of integration between SNAP and Medicaid, they may have think that they can't do it. Well, this will show you that there are states with a variety of eligibility systems, a variety of arrangements that are over 50% or even over 75% in their renewal rate. So it just gives an idea of what can be accomplished. So sounds great, right? Just increase your ex parte rate. Well, how do we do that? As with many things, it's about the details. So when you're looking into how your state actually processes ex parte renewals, the first thing to ask is what data sources does the system check? And we say system here because in most cases, the ex parte process is automated in the eligibility system and actually done without the touch of a caseworker, which has some advantages as far as consistency, because we know caseworkers aren't always consistent in application of rules, but it's also sometimes kind of an opaque process because it's not something that you can just talk through with somebody. So you want to know what data sources the system checks. Generally, states will check the Federal Data Services Hub, which contains information from the work number, also known as Equifax or TOX. It can contain IRS information, so tax data, which is particularly useful for self-employed individuals who do file their taxes, and information on unearned income from the Social Security Administration. A lot of states also check their own state data sources. So they might look at their monthly or quarterly wage data, commonly known as AWVS, or even their SNAP data, which will have recently verified income information that's very reliable. So this gives you an idea of the different data sources the state is pinging in order to verify particularly income eligibility at renewal. But then we really get into the sticky question of what does it mean to indicate ongoing eligibility? So there are a lot of different scenarios to go through. The first one should be pretty straightforward. If the household only has unearned income and that's confirmed in a data source, it should be pretty straightforward that that individual or that household is eligible to be renewed through the ex parte process. Similarly, if somebody applied and reported one job and one set of income, and the state checks data sources 12 months later and finds information from the same job and about the same income as before, and that income is below the eligibility threshold, that should be pretty straightforward and the household should be renewed. But then it gets a little bit more complicated. So say, for example, the household reports no income. There's no income in the case file as reported as application. The state checks these data sources and finds no income reported in those data sources as well. That looks like a straightforward case, and frankly, it should be. But sometimes states become kind of nervous around a situation like this. And if there's no income in the data source, they want to send a form to the client. They want the client to actually sign a form and say, I have no income. And they want to make sure that there's not income that's being missed from self-employment income or something else like that. This can be a large portion of the population because we know, by definition, a lot of people who need Medicaid do not have income. And so it's something to look into as far as how a state would handle this situation because it really is in alignment. They really are verifying that the person continues to be eligible because there's no income showing up. Similarly, some people maybe had income in the case file and reported that they were working when they applied, but now the data sources are showing no income. Folks who work with clients regularly know, oh, they probably lost their job and are not working right now, or in between jobs, or had seasonal employment. And that seems like a straightforward situation, and again, it should be. But this is another situation where states sometimes balk at allowing the ex parte renewal to continue and want to check in with the client to make sure that they really have no income. Another scenario might be where there are different employers in the case file and in the data source. Sometimes it's actually the same job, but it just shows up differently. For example, if somebody's working at Kentucky Fried Chicken, that's what they might report on their application, but the data source might show the parent company of Yum Brand Foods, and that causes a discrepancy that can cause problems. A lot of states say we're not going to worry about employer names because that just confuses things. You've got spellings, you've got different kind of forms of the titles of the companies. So you want to make sure your state's not getting hung up on making sure that the exact employers match. Finally, self-employment income is a tricky one that states struggle with. There is generally not a reliable data source to verify self-employment income. The best one available is IRS data, is tax data if the individual is filing income tax returns. And that can be very useful to verify self-employment income. But we know a lot of clients are kind of working on the side or not working enough that they actually do file taxes. So some states will say, if there's self-employment income on the case, they're not eligible for the ex parte process. And there are arguments to be made that the beneficiary is still being sent a notice saying this is the basis of your determination. You're responsible for reporting anything that's different. There are arguments to be made that self-employment is essentially attestation anyway, even if a client does submit various documentations and reasons to proceed. But that one's a little bit more of a legitimate hesitation by the state. These other scenarios, really the state should be pushed to allow cases like this to go through the ex parte process and not get hung up on these fine details. So as we've looked into how states process ex parte renewals, there are some common pitfalls. For example, some states will exclude entire categories of cases. We've seen states say, oh, cases that have SNAP on them are not eligible to go through the Medicaid ex parte process. And that takes a huge chunk of the Medicaid population out of eligibility for ex parte and is really unnecessary. Medicaid cases with SNAP, there are a lot of opportunities to actually coordinate their renewals and leverage the income verification process on SNAP, which is very thorough and precise, to push forward Medicaid or conduct ex parte Medicaid renewals using SNAP. And Shelby's going to talk about that a little bit later. Another common pitfall is when a state determines that a household is ineligible for ex parte if they're changing types of coverage. So for example, it might be a child going from Medicaid coverage to CHIP coverage or vice versa. So if there's a change in the benefits package or even like the premiums and co-pays and other things, a state might say, they're not going to go through the ex parte process. We've got to actually send them a form and require them to respond. On the one hand, that's some reasonable hesitation because if you're actually going to put somebody into a premium category or change their benefits package, you want to make sure that your information is accurate. But on the other hand, that exposes these households to all of the problems associated with procedural denials and the fact that they might not get that form, might not understand it, might not return it, the agency might not work it properly. So here we say, okay, you can put them in the new category and that information is going to be on the notice that goes to the beneficiary. Once again, that beneficiary has the opportunity to respond to that notice and say, no, that income is too high. I just got a few hours of overtime last month. That's not representative. Or other issues that would come back to the state and have them correct the exact income that has been counted and the exact category that somebody is going to be fit into. So another thing to watch for. And states get very fine on this. Sometimes they actually would look at if the parent was eligible under previous 1931 standards versus under the expanded Medicaid, under ACA. And things like that that are very fine differentiations that don't make a lot of difference to the client, but can put people at risk by not allowing the ex parte renewal and exposing them to the problems of procedural denials. Finally, some states verify too many things at renewal. They might verify things that are not subject to change. For example, citizenship status. And this can open up a whole can of worms that should have been addressed at application and does not need to be done during the ex parte process. So we obviously want the ex parte process to be successful wherever possible, but sometimes it's not going to be successful. So what does the agency have to do if ex parte renewals are not successful? Well, the first thing, as we've mentioned, is that the agency must send a pre-populated renewal notice. And again, states have different definitions of pre-populated. We want to see more than just a name and an address. That doesn't count as pre-populated. When the state shares what information they have on file, so the household members, the income that's been counted previously, that allows the beneficiary to more easily respond to that and say, are there any corrections, is anything different, and update that form rather than essentially starting from scratch. After that renewal notice is sent, the beneficiary must be given at least 30 days to return that notice. We've seen some states that have gone to 10 days or kind of done these renewals when they're catching up on the process and not giving clients a lot of time to respond. That's not allowable. They have to have at least 30 days to return that renewal form. In addition, the agency must allow that renewal to take place by mail, by phone, online, or in person. So the same means of interface as during the application process. A lot of states do not have a phone or an online process in place yet, even though they are required to by the regs. And that's an important area to push them to expand options for clients to actually complete that renewal. Another thing to look at is to minimize the verification requests. So we know that in this situation, the client has to be sent a form and that form has to be sent back. But sometimes the agencies take it further and then say, okay, I got your form, now I need pay stubs. Now I need a letter from somebody, additional verifications that can bog down the whole process and again increase the chance that eligible people will lose benefits. And here we want to look at the reasonable compatibility policy. This is a really beneficial policy that CMS put forward that can really simplify things and minimize verification requests. And what reasonable compatibility says is that if the attestation and the data source are both below the eligibility threshold, no further verification is required. And what this means is if a client reports income, let's say equal to 20% of the poverty level for their household size, and the state then checks the data source, this is again more of the traditional renewal process where the client sent in a form, the caseworker would then look at their data sources, and if that data source shows income at 80% of the poverty level, or even 100% of the poverty level, it doesn't matter. Those two are reasonably compatible because both that attestation and data source are below the top eligibility threshold. And I'm assuming an eligibility threshold of 138% in this case. And so the client should not be pended for verification. Those should be determined reasonably compatible, and things should move forward. Now, some states have what's called a reasonable compatibility standard of maybe 5% or 10% that applies at the top eligibility threshold. So again, using 138% as the eligibility threshold, this might be where a client attests to income on their renewal form of about 136%. But then the data source comes back showing 139% or 140%, just over the eligibility threshold. There, the state might say, okay, I have a 5% reasonable compatibility standard because the data source is within 5% of the attestation. I'm going to waive the difference, and this person continues to be eligible for Medicaid. And the reason for that is to kind of prevent some back and forth between the marketplace and people who are really right at that threshold getting shuttled back and forth. The key here, though, is that only applies at the eligibility threshold. A lot of states misapply this across the income spectrum. So in the example I gave before where the attestation was 20% of the poverty level and the data source came back at 80%, some states say, oh, those are more than 5% apart, therefore they're not reasonably compatible and I need verification. That is incorrect. And that is what we see time and time again in state policies as well as in eligibility systems. So it's something to look into. This affects both applications and renewals and can really bog down the whole process and fail to take advantage of this really good policy. Another provision within renewals when the ex parte is not successful is this 90-day reconsideration period, which I mentioned earlier, that if somebody does lose benefits at their, under their certification period and comes back and requests Medicaid within 90 days, they only have to complete the renewal process. They cannot be made to complete a whole new application. And finally, just a reminder of a mainstay of Medicaid policy, if somebody is determined ineligible for their current category of assistance, the agency must consider their eligibility for other categories. And that can apply if somebody's turning 18 to 19, 64 to 65, their income is crossing some threshold, whatever it might be, the agency must consider their eligibility for other categories. Now, I want to touch on non-MAGI renewals for a moment, because we often think of MAGI renewals when we think of ex parte. But ex parte is required for non-MAGI cases as well. Now, states often get hung up on assets for the non-MAGI population, which is really unfortunate because this is such a great population for the ex parte process because they tend to have a very stable income. They often don't have earned income. They don't have a lot of complications. But the states get hung up on the assets. So for one thing, the state does not have to verify the assets or can rely on the fact that they're, again, sending this notice and requiring the client to respond if something is inaccurate. But there is a new opportunity that states can use an asset verification system, an AVS, for electronic verification of assets. And this is something that CMS has mandated. And a lot of states are focusing on using the AVS more on the back end as kind of a gotcha for clients, or more in the long-term care context, where there's a lot more detailed assessment of assets required. But the AVS really presents an opportunity to be used on the front end as an electronic data source in conjunction with other income verification. And it can be run the same way the state might ping other data sources, whether state data sources or the Federal Data Services Hub. Again, it matters the details of this. How does a state really look at this? And you want to kind of think of it as maybe setting a reasonable compatibility policy for assets. This principle that if the difference between what the client reports and the data source, if it's immaterial, not to pen somebody for verification. and not to get hung up on things like bank names. If a client reports that they've got $100 at X bank, the data AVS shows that they've got $100 at Y bank, why make this complicated? There's a good chance that X was bought out by Y bank, and that's why there's a different name on it. Or fine, even if they have $100 at each bank, that's way less than the overall eligibility threshold. So this presents a good opportunity for states to actually be able to electronically verify assets and facilitate ex parte renewals for the non-MAGI population as well. So these are some opportunities to improve the ex parte rate and some good policies. But how do you actually get a state to do it? That starts by looking at what they're doing right now and really digging into the current state of affairs. So the first thing to do is review policy. Sometimes in an online policy manual or other documents you might have access to, some of this information is outlined. It might tell you what data sources the state is looking at when attempting an ex parte renewal. You're probably going to have some policy around reasonable compatibility. See if that policy is correct, if it's clear, if caseworkers are actually following it and taking advantage of it to not require unnecessary verification documents. And sometimes a policy might even have some sort of a process flow that tells you what cases can go through the ex parte pipeline, how they then come to the state. And it can also expose you to different terminology the state might use, whether they're using automated or ex parte or automatic or other things that can mean different things in each state context. But the next step is really critical, and that's reviewing the system design documents. As we've talked about, these processes are generally automated in the eligibility system and happens behind the scenes. And requesting a design document will give you more information on how the eligibility system actually processes renewals. A design document is a documentation of essentially what the policy folks have told the programmers to put into the eligibility system, and should contain a lot of these details that we've discussed in the webinar so far, as far as these different scenarios and how the eligibility system should process them, and if they should get an ex parte renewal or not. So it can be kind of complex, it can be difficult to process, but this is really where the meat of the matter is. And another advantage to asking about system design documents is it might provoke the agency to really look at them again. In many cases, these processes were programmed in the chaos of 2013 and 2014 and ACA implementation, and they may not have been revisited since then. And now there's a lot more information about what CMS allows, about just MAGI in general, and about what other states have done. And just by bringing this up and kind of opening up this box, it gives you an opportunity to look in there and say, do we really have to cut this group out of ex parte? Can we change this rule to make the process smoother for everybody? And really to save the state a lot of work. The final thing to do is to request data from the state, to have them really look at their success rate of ex parte renewals, how many cases go through that process and don't require action by the client. For the cases that do not successfully go through the ex parte process, why? Why do they fail the process? How many fail for each reason? So you might find that there's a reason that there's a pending action on the case, and that takes them out of the ex parte process. Or that income can't be verified, and that takes them out. By finding out these different reasons and the numbers by reason, that'll help you direct your advocacy and find, whoa, we're losing a ton of people for this reason. Oh, this reason's a little bit of a technicality. We're not going to worry about it too much. And you can really prioritize your advocacy. You can also ask for the success rate of Medicaid renewals overall. And that might point to a big problem happening. Maybe a lot aren't going through ex parte, and they're also having trouble going through the traditional process where clients aren't returning documents or the state is behind in processing those documents. And that can really give you fodder, especially if you're going to engage other entities like managed care organizations who might really care that 40 or 50% of people are falling off during the renewal each time. And then in connection with that, look at churn. How many of those people who are falling off at renewal are coming back in? Whether you're measuring it by 30 days later, 60 days later, or 90 days later. It gives you an idea of how many people are falling off, very likely for procedural reasons, rather than them being found ineligible. And that really will give you more credence to this idea of improving ex parte and keeping those eligible folks on. So next, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Shelby, who's going to talk about opportunities to use enrollment in SNAP to facilitate Medicaid renewals.
Thanks, Jen. And hello, everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about using SNAP for Medicaid renewals. And it's important to kind of remember, even though, as Jen pointed out earlier, that in some cases, um, the states are saying, forget it. Like if you have SNAP, then we're not going to take you out of ex parte altogether. The reality is states are required to use SNAP information to inform their eligibility determinations, including renewals. Um, Having said that, the states are also allowed to do so, use SNAP information to the extent they find it useful. So states can drive a truck through that, right? And in some cases, they have a variety of reasons why they find using SNAP information for the purpose of making a Medicaid determination, either finding it useful or not useful. But one reason that some states have identified that it's not useful is because SNAP uses different methods, right? For determining eligibility. They're not the same as MAGI or not the same as the methods that are used in traditional Medicaid either, or the other categorical um, Medicaid, although it's a little bit more similar. So states do have several different options to simplify the use of SNAP information, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about three of them. Next slide, please. So first, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about express lane eligibility. It's a state plan option. It's been around for some time. Since 2009, CHIPRA authorized it. It can be used for Medicaid. It can be used for CHIP. It can be used to make eligibility determinations, both new ones as well as renewals, and even to for the purposes of verifying change reporting as well. It can be used for only children. It is only an option that can be used to make eligibility determinations for children, which sometimes is a big blocker for states, using it, especially states who've expanded Medicaid and oftentimes are not looking at just a household that's made up of children. They're actually, thankfully, the good news is that in many states, they're also looking at children and parents. So express lane eligibility has really great features in that it allows a state to adopt the methods of the host program. So I find that SNAP is the best program of the benefit programs to use, just because there is so much overlap, and there are so many people that are enrolled in SNAP. So it is a great option, especially in states that don't have Medicaid expansion. So and there are several non-expansion states that do use this for children. Or it can also be used in conjunction with other state options, which I'll talk to you a little bit about that are available for adults. So in the next slide, I'm going to talk to you about one of the fast-track options. We refer to it as fast-track waiver option, and sometimes we used to refer to it as strategy 3, which is just because it happened to be a part of a set of strategies, these waivers that were in this great guidance that was given to states in the implementation of the ACA. The guidance, outlined a bunch of different strategies that states could take, and they could activate these kinds of 1902E 14A waivers, which are not like your everyday waivers that we think about, that are pretty complex, hard to get, can in some cases be like, could take a very, very long time to get. These were instead, they were in some ways a fast track waiver, and basically the waiver authority was given to the secretary to provide to states that needed some like a boost to be able to prepare for the transition between traditional Medicaid and Medicaid under the ACA. So within that authority, this option was created, and it allows states to temporarily use SNAP to determine income eligibility for Medicaid. It the way that the states activate it was pretty easy. The states meet on a regular basis with CMS staff, and during those meetings, they can say, hey, we're having X, Y, or Z problem, and they can still do this today. In fact, we've heard of states that have, expressed concerns that they were having in one way or the other, and CMS has expressed to them that yes, they could still, within their toolbox, this is still a waiver that was still available to them. So if they're having some type of issue, maybe their like system is still having hiccups, which, believe it or not, still happens in terms of that transition to ACA. I don't have to tell you all, right? So if a state is able to identify an issue, in some cases it's been a case, they're just behind on their renewals or something to that effect. They can then implement this option, and it basically is very similar to express lane eligibility, but it does have some caveats. The way that I say that it's similar to express lane eligibility, what I mean by that is that it does allow you to say, if you're participating in SNAP, therefore we're going to go ahead and take that you meet the financial eligibility for Medicaid. Assuming that you're talking about people who are in the right income threshold. So adults that have expanded in states that have expanded Medicaid would fit that mark. So there's a couple caveats that limit this option. One is that it requires that a person have a full MAGI determination after 12 months after its use. So in other words, it can't be used on an ongoing basis for the same individual. So it could also be used for renewals, but then it could only be used once, right? And it can't be used on anybody who came in a Medicaid based off of this route in terms of a simplification. So it really was designed to help on a temporary basis. But there's another option, which I'll tell you about in the next slide. And that one is what we refer to as a fast-track state plan option. And that one can be used both for enrollments and renewals, but it does limit a little bit what states can do, because states have to do some, they have to figure out who, that distracted me, sorry. They have to figure out individuals who are certain to qualify for Medicaid under MAGI rules. And the way that they do that, and there is a guidance that we have linked here for you on this slide. But in general, what the states are doing in the next slide, well, I'll explain a little bit, what some of those differences are, is that the states have to identify cohorts. You can go to the next slide. Cohorts, like they have to take people, they have to take their SNAP caseload. They have to identify, who their target population is. In other words, people who, in the case of a renewal, they would say, okay, this is a person who is, this is everybody who's going in for renewal, the adults, right? Hopefully you could just use express lane for the kids, right? So we're looking for adults that are going through a renewal, that are in the SNAP caseload, and then they're going to do some kind of slicing and dicing of those adults that are due for a Medicaid renewal, and they pop up in the SNAP caseload, which there's again a lot of overlap, right? They basically have to look at the broad criteria. So they have to first make sure that they're in, they're using the applicable, standard, because this can also be used in states that haven't expanded Medicaid. Obviously, you're going to find a lot more people that can benefit from this if they are in a state that has expanded. Medicaid. So, 138% of the federal poverty line, let's say, in a state that's expanded. They have to remove anybody who is on Medicaid based off of, being in the age category, so anybody over 65. They would have to remove all members of the SNAP household. They can include everybody that includes everybody in the SNAP household that's eligible for SNAP. So basically, what you don't want is you wouldn't be including people who have ineligible members in their family in the SNAP unit, because then we don't know enough information about those individuals, not because we're talking about them as the people who we're trying to renew on the Medicaid side. And then there's some additional information that states don't know based off of the information that they have on SNAP. So there has to be a mechanism for states to gather some additional information, which includes, whether or not there's the household has any income that is included in MAGI, and it's delineated within that guidance that we're talking about. I won't bore you with all of those details in this call, but it's excluded in SNAP. So there's only a handful of items. So I'll give you an example, well, actually, in the next one, it's a household example. So nobody in the SNAP household is part of a taxed household that includes individuals who live outside of the home. So, in some cases, because again, the SNAP household, the SNAP case file would not have all the information that's needed for that purpose, for the purpose of making sure that people are certain to be eligible. So states who have used this option have found kind of clever or easier ways of gathering this type of information without, again, requiring somebody, the household, to provide loads and loads of information, or there's ways to find out about this without having to have an entire new renewal process being completed, or an entire new application in the case that states are using it to inform an eligibility for new enrollment. There are a couple of odds and ends, some SNAP options that in some states have elected to use, including a simplified way of counting self-employment income. That's a big one that's used in a lot of states. If the state has taken up that option, then that's another example of a cohort that you would have to remove from being able to use this as a way to make the determination of ongoing eligibility for an individual that's in Medicaid and SNAP. Next slide. We're back to you, Jen.
Thanks so much, Shelby. And for any of you interested in really diving into this, Shelby's definitely your go-to resource to learn about all these intricacies that a state would have to do. So next, we're going to hear from Beth Shapiro and Louise Hayes at Community Legal Services of Philadelphia about their experience trying to really dig into the ex parte renewal issue. Beth and Louise?
Hi, this is Beth. Louise will jump in whenever she has something to add. So next slide, please. We are just providing a kind of a bird's eye overview of our journey. Some may call it a quest to try to find out more about how Pennsylvania is conducting its ex parte Medicaid renewal process. We renewed our efforts to dig into this process last January of 2018. And we were motivated by our concerns that the paperwork burden involved, as Jen described, is really falls both on the caseworkers and on our clients. And the especially hard result for our clients are the bad outcomes of losing Medicaid, having to reapply, losing again, that sort of thing. We were also dismayed to look at the Kaiser Family Foundation survey from 2018 and find that Pennsylvania had reported that they were renewing fewer than 25% of Medicaid cases through the ex parte process. So that led to our trying to get some more information. And we did this through the methods that Jen outlined. Our journey started with requests to the state for the policy documents explaining how the process works and how the decisions are being made. And in addition, requests for data, most basically the number of cases going through the ex parte process and those that and the number that are approved. With our terrific ASAP partners who bring really varied expertise to the table, we had a series of meetings with policy staff at the State Department of Human Services and got some info that helped us a little further along in understanding both the policy and a little bit about the operations. And then at a certain point, we decided that we needed to go to higher level officials to really make this, to ask them to make this more of a priority. So we requested meetings with a newer secretary for Human Services in Pennsylvania and with Governor's Policy Office staff to highlight the issues. These meetings occurred last fall. We were heading into the second term of Governor Wolf, who had championed Medicaid expansion. And our hope was to deliver the message that Pennsylvania really can do better than being at the bottom, in the bottom quartile for ex parte renewals, and that the process needs a closer look. And this we emphasized dovetails with Governor Wolf's initiative to make sure that we have a government that works, which is his way of trying to identify ways that state agencies can work more efficiently and effectively. We thought this was a perfect fit. Next slide, please. So here is a chart that we received after about 6 months of these various requests for policy documents and numbers. You may not be able to see all the numbers, which is fine. I really just want to highlight a few things. This gave us finally some numbers that we could and the success rate. But we hold up. This is the business process flow over about a 5-month period, but these aren't actual numbers. Nonetheless, what this flow chart showed us were really two major things. At the top, you can see in the yellow and then the burnt orange box, that's the ex parte process, what Pennsylvania calls automated renewal. And you can see that before the yellow box and just after it, there are two dramatic vertical drops. And in the first vertical drop, these are cases that were selected to go through ex parte, but immediately fell out, about 45%, so almost half. And we asked why, and we were told, well, these are all the joint cases with SNAP and non-MAGI Medicaid categories involving resources. So immediately, Pennsylvania has not been, it became clear that Pennsylvania was just discounting all of those cases. The second vertical drop after the yellow box is also substantial, and that's about 65% of the remaining cases fall out of the ex parte process. Why? Because they're failing data matching. And that led us to calculate that only about 12% of those selected for ex parte renewal were actually successful, and about 4% of all renewals were successful over this time period. And this was really disheartening to see in print, and it led to, of course, more questions. Next slide, please. This next slide is what was yielded from further questions about that second vertical drop. What is happening? What are the data matching points? And we just highlighted here some of the largest reasons that, or the reasons that the largest number of cases fail. And we are continuing to ask questions about, well, what are exactly the data being matched? What are the underlying policy decisions about how closely data sources match? And that led us to to submit a right to know request, to try to request that Pennsylvania system design document that Jen also referenced earlier. Next slide, please. So along this journey, what we found are these 5 main points. It is not clear still to us what the policy decisions driving the automated eligibility review process are. We suspect that this system was programmed pretty hastily in 2013-2014 when it was not the priority of, or Medicaid was not the priority of our previous gubernatorial administration, and that the system really hasn't been reviewed since then. Secondly, we really think that the number of cases selected for EMR, or excuse me, selected for ex parte review is too narrow. For example, all joint SNAP Medicaid cases, and we've begun to ask more questions about including cases where there are, we know there's no, because we have no asset limit in SNAP, certain SNAP cases that could immediately be re-channeled through the chute and run through the ex parte process. Number 3, as discussed, there's a high number of cases that are failing, and we are asking more questions about whether the data matching systems are too finely matched, whether the right data matching systems are being used, etc. Number 4, this so far has been, this ex parte process has not been very effective at reducing the paperwork burden in Pennsylvania, and we're concerned about the continued reliance on verification of income and assets, making people go to the bank to get those statements and turn them in when they're not really needed. And that also raises the potential for discretion, error, loss of verification, mail delays, and of course, then people can get caught off when they really are eligible. And then 5th, we discovered that Pennsylvania uses the ex parte term really to describe a back-end process. After a case has failed the automated renewal process and after a pre-populated form goes out to the client, then Pennsylvania says, well, we'll do an ex parte renewal, I put that in quotes, through the caseworker taking one last look. We understand this is not the general understanding of ex parte, and we're trying to see about ways to change that. Next slide, please. So in our continuing quest, we are still digging in for some hard data about these numbers. On the new Kaiser Family Foundation chart, Pennsylvania has now reported that they are 25 to 50 in the 25 to 50% range, and so we have more questions about whether that really has been an increase or not. And we are still pursuing through the right to know request and our other a mediation process that's resulted, whether there is a design document that will help us understand the decisions made in programming the system. The good news is that Pennsylvania, as a result of these meetings and requests, has finally agreed that they should review this process, and they have already told us that they've brought their policy and systems, computer system staff into the same room. They're looking more closely at the rejection reasons. They're trying to produce and share data to get at the basic elements of this process and see what can be more finely tuned. We, as advocates, of course, are watching all of that carefully, continuing to have discussions with them, and also continuing to pursue this culture change to try to reduce the demand for verification when other data sources exist. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you to all of our presenters today for the great information. We do have a few minutes left for questions. If people have questions, please submit those through the question box, and we will get started with our first question. I believe probably for Jennifer. The question is, how does the renewal process that should apply if a person is within the 90-day limit differ from the application process? Our state makes people go through the online application no matter what the situation.
Okay, so I assume you're referring to the 90-day reconciliation or reconsideration period when somebody loses coverage at the renewal point and tries to come back on. So what should happen is that they should only need to complete the renewal form. Ideally, it should be pre-populated for them, and they should only complete that rather than having to go through the entire application as if they were applying anew for benefits. So that's concerning that your state makes them go through the whole online application process no matter what the situation. I would also wonder if at renewal, some states actually during the renewal, rather than a pre-populated renewal form, they make clients go through an entirely new application process. So hopefully that's not happening. It should not be. But during that reconsideration process, they should just be asked to complete the renewal form, not a whole new application. It should be shorter, it should be pre-populated, it should be much easier than a new application.
Thank you, Jen. And the next question I think is that's for Shelby. Shelby, the question is, can fast track be used for, quote, classic Medicaid programs?
So being like categorical eligibility, like for folks who are age blind or disabled, I think it's an excellent question. It can this is something that is subject to be explored, and the reason why I say that is because as designed, it was designed for MAGI Medicaid populations. However, I've had numerous conversations with CMS, with other, and with states as well, that have been interested in further exploring whether or not it could be used for other, groups. And there seems to be a fair amount of interest in figuring out how that could happen. So if it's something that your state is seriously considering, I would encourage them to look into it, to talk to CMS, to say they're interested, and I'd be happy to talk with them as well.
Great, thank you, Shelby. I think we have time for just a couple more. We have had a couple of questions about where to look for the citations or guidance on the 30 days to return a renewal. And if you look in the questions box, Jennifer did put up an answer with that information. And then the next question will go to Jen. What are arguments that state agencies use to justify not using ex parte renewals when there's a change in programs such as from CHIP to Medicaid or vice versa?
Generally, they rely on the fact that maybe the benefits package changes, or there's a different premium or copay structure. I think that's how they look at it. But if you really unpack that, it doesn't seem to really be justification, because they still need to be notified of it and have the opportunity to respond if any of that information is incorrect. And usually the data sources do tend to have some valid information, and if somebody changed categories, they changed categories. Putting the client in a situation where they may lose benefits altogether is not the answer to that. But I think it's just kind of a mentality of their new benefit is different than their old benefit, therefore I have to somehow go to them and get a more refined income determination. But again, that puts their overall benefits at risk, and that's the problem.
Thanks, Jen. And that brings us to the hour. I know we have several questions that came in that we didn't get a chance to answer. What we will do is go through those and try to put together some written answers for those and submit those back out to you guys so you guys can all see those. And we'll also be sharing the slides. So thank you again to all of our presenters today for taking the time to do this webinar, and to all of the attendees who joined us today. We hope you found it useful. And please be in touch with any follow-up questions that you have. Have a great afternoon.